And I think there what we can start to understand is that there's really a lot in the transition from Shaul to David that will help us to make sense of things. So Shaul Amalek was the first king of Israel, and he came from Shevet Binyamin, the tribe of Benjamin. And David was the second king, and he came from the tribe of Yehudah. And the plot of how David takes over the kingship from Shaul, and really how this even is precipitated by events that precede anything that has particularly to do with David, and have more to do with the interaction between Shaul and Shmuel, the prophet, is very intricate and interesting. I think we should start with the idea that, why did Shaul become king? Shaul became king because the people were being attacked and afflicted by their enemy, the Plishtim. And the principal role of the king is to unite the people in war against an enemy. And this wasn't particularly possible during Sefer Shoftim, the book of Judges, and people went to Shmuel Hanavi, Samuel the prophet, and demanded a king, and so he gave them a king, and the king was Shaul. And Shaul, among other things, was just kind of tall, meaning, he was a fighter, an admirable, impressive individual who could lead the people in battle. And when he's made king by Shmuel, he was trying to find the lost donkeys of his father that had run away. And so he's showing responsibility to his ancestry in some sense. So there's something kind of basically appealing about the personality of Shaul, and he's charismatic, and he's strong, and he's tall. So he gets made king, and he's successful in his wars against the Plishtim. But ultimately, there are two events that maybe you could say are the same, or kind of a repeat, or maybe they're two different events, but they point in the same direction. Two moments where Shmuel says basically, Kadosh Baruch Hu has taken away from you the kingship. One of which is where Shaul refuses to wait for the arrival of priests who have the proper role as the operators of the sacrificial cult, and he, as king, instead performs a sacrifice for the people, which is a major transgression because it arrogates too much power to the kingship. And that already, according to Shmuel, is reason that the kingship should be torn away from him. But there's another sequence of events in which there's almost kind of a repetition of the statement by Shmuel that Shaul is no longer meant to be king, and that has to do with Amalek. So Amalek, again, is the nation that savagely attacks us at our flank and targets the weak, and is ideologically opposed to the existence of the Jewish people and wants to annihilate us, and all these kind of Nazi Hamas kind of characteristics. And when Shaul makes war against Amalek, he decides not to kill off the king, Agag, and not to destroy all the spoils of the war, so that he can turn those spoils, like the sheep, the livestock, into offerings to Hashem, into korbanot, into sacrifices. Which is, again, notice that it's partly also about the transgression of improper decision-making about how to perform sacrifices. But the point is, I think there are many elements in here that already start to remind one in some ways of things that you could say are both admirable and perhaps not so admirable about the development of the modern state of Israel through the lens of Torah. Meaning, on the one hand, there was a great necessity for there to be any kind of Jewish state to defend the Jews at the moment when the state was created. Globally, there had been a terrible war with a terrible enemy that nearly annihilated the Jewish people. And when the state came into being, the mere fact that there now was an address for the army of the Jewish people, and that army had marching orders to defend the lives and safety of Jews anywhere in the world where they were threatened, but particularly in the land of Israel, that was the first step, and a glorious first step, and one that needed to be made, and one that could be made by a variety of types of people. It didn't necessarily have to be one made by someone who was fully committed to every aspect of the Torah. And there could still be great merit in taking that step. And I don't want to talk about Shaul quite in that light, because obviously it's very complicated to fully import him into the modern context. There was no such thing as secularism or socialism or anything like that in the life and times of Shaul Amalek. But I do think in what we already described about Shaul, there's a significant element to point out there, which is that his improper performance of sacrifice, in which he, as the king, who's like the leader in battle and the political leader, also became the orchestrator of sacrifices for the people, that does have the ring a bit of, let's say, worship of the state, worship of the military commanders, and these things that really were in the trappings and symbols of the early state of Israel, where our generals were these demigods, because they ran the army and the army defended us, and everyone contributed to the army, and the army became this kind of central object of devotion for the society. And on the one hand, for very reasonable kinds of characteristics it possessed, right? You do want to be devoted to something that saves your life and that keeps you safe, especially when that was such a new thing for Jews to have the means of defending themselves. And not only that, but it was a great mitzvah. It was, in fact, part of keeping the Torah for Jews to have an army and defend themselves. And so it was a step in the right direction, but it was a step that, if taken in place of the rest of the Torah, can turn into a kind of idolatry, right? If you just say, okay, we have an army, now the army will keep us safe. And then once we're in a safe place with our army, we can do whatever we want. And we don't have any other jobs, obligations, constraints on how we act. And obviously things slid a little bit in that direction, because this was not a society that had a commitment to the mission of Am Yisrael, of the Jewish people as a whole, as understood by the Torah, across the board. It's been much more complicated and bumpy ride in that sense. And so now we have to understand how David fits into that story. So we were saying that Shaul was maybe doing something improper with sacrifices. I'll also add, he refused to fully kill off Amalek, right? He kept the political leadership of Amalek around. He tried to take spoils from Amalek and redevote them to service of Hashem. So there was this sort of idea of, well, maybe, we can get richer from not going all the way in our fight against Amalek, and that's okay because we're going to make such proper and beautiful creations out of that wealth that will elevate it, and so it's for the right reason, and also maybe we can get that wealth partly by dealing with the king instead of killing him off. Like maybe he told us where all the livestock were hidden, whatever. But the point is that there's even, in fact, when the king of Amalek is trying to avoid being killed off by Shmuel, he's sort of talking about the time for wars past, and let's speak gently to each other. There's kind of a peace process that's trying to go on there, right? There's this idea that Shaul thinks that he can deal with Amalek instead of following the Torah and getting rid of Amalek. And that also has been obviously a major part of the history of the state of Israel since, you could say, maybe this starting in the 1980s, but certainly with Oslo and everything since the Hitnakut, the withdrawal from Gaza, what got us to where we are now. This idea of saying, sure, there are people here who say all the time that they want to wipe out our entire nation, and that they're constantly trying as best they can with what means at their disposal they have to prepare for that day. But we're strong, we're mighty, we're clever, and so they can just make their noise, occasionally bother us, but we have the upper hand, so why worry about it? Which is, it's flat out ignoring the statement by the Torah, as we've said, lo tishkach, don't forget to wipe out Amalek. Don't prefer the stability and temporary peace of not dealing with it, and instead remember that your job is to aggressively and actively and preemptively seek to wipe out Amalek, for no other reason than that he's there saying what he's saying, which identifies him as Amalek. So those are the two problems with Shaul. And now the question is, how does David fit in? If we're trying to say that, okay, those are maybe some things that were true in the last 75 years about the modern state of Israel, that there was a bit of, let's combine religion with worship of our battle leader, and kind of replace the Torah with that a little bit. And also, let's not fully go all the way in wiping out Amalek because it's inconvenient. We can maybe get richer by not doing so, and we'll make such a beautiful society with that wealth that it's worth it. That will be our offering to Hashem in a way, however you want to put it. So that's Shaul, and that's maybe also the modern state of Israel as led by its kind of legacy labor Zionist and revisionist Zionist elites that we have from the era when the state was politically controlled by those who explicitly turned in a different direction than the Torah, when ultimately describing the ideology that guided their decision making. They may have been referenced to our tradition, but they ultimately were not going to rely on it when it came down to how you win wars, etc. And so, where does David come in when he steps into the story? Well, interestingly, David has different aspects in how he enters the story of Shaul, and they don't even entirely seem to line up. Like, you kind of are a little bit confused in reading it, because on the one hand, we all know David is the guy who steps up and beats Goliath. Goliath is the giant of the Plishtim who's humiliating the hosts of Israel, and David is this young shepherd who's bringing food to his brothers in the battlefield, but he's so outraged that this Philistine is mocking the hosts of Elohim Chaim, the living God, that he just says, who else is going to kill this guy? I'm going to go out and get him. And so he brings a sling and he fells Goliath and cuts off his head. But although that in some ways is already a path to political success for him because he's promised the hand of the king's daughter in marriage, there's also this other way David is introduced into the life of Shaul, which is that Shaul has this kind of loss of spirit that's described, where he needs something to uplift him. And so David is hired as this harpist to sort of play and sing for Shaul, and give him a bit of I'm obviously paraphrasing everything right now, so we're not reading from the text, but it's about taking a sort of ruach ra and turning it into a ruach tov, like taking the sort of evil spirit and turning it into a good one, converting his psychological constitution into a better form. And I think that latter aspect is interesting, particularly in the way that you could say Torah and Judaism have been seen in the secular modern state of Israel as kind of a sidekick or handmaiden or, passenger, maybe a very important and special one in some sense, where we say, and this goes back to Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion, much more so than many people in some of the parties that sort of evolved out of his, who may still serve in Knesset in the present day, appreciated that the texts of the Jewish tradition were, a part of what the nation was to become, and that we should be reading them and studying them, even if he wasn't himself advocating that everyone keep the whole Torah or study in yeshiva or what have you. But the point is that there has been this idea that the Jewish tradition is the heritage of the country, and that maybe that's something we all should have some relationship to, and it should kind of shape the calendar and should shape the style of the country, and in the formalities. Perhaps we should have a bit of this is kosher and that doesn't happen on Shabbat and all of these things. So I think you could say that to some degree there has been this understanding from the beginning that even if ultimately political power was supposed to, from its inception, rest in the hands of the secular Israeliyut, the secular Israeliness that had been invented as an alternative to Yahadut, or Judaism based on Torah, even if power was supposed to rest in those hands, it was still thought to be the case. Like, we're not trying to get rid of this other stuff. It's good. It's nice. We actually all like it to a certain degree. We all do it to a certain degree. It's what we have in common. It binds us together. It gives us a common culture to some degree. It gives us something that does uplift us, that does add meaning to what we're doing, but only up to a point. Meaning, you can bring David in to play his harp for the king, but David can't be king. Right? And if the king, Shaul, begins to suspect, as he does, that David is somehow a threat to him in that regard, suddenly Shaul doesn't like David anymore. And even though David plays nice music for him, Shaul might suddenly throw a spear at him, as happens also in Tanakh. So somehow looking at this through the lens of the present takes a bunch of perplexing and confusing and strange things that happen in the text of Tanakh itself, where you say, does Shaul like David or does he not? Because he sometimes is doing these things that say, I'm, investing in you and I'm bringing you into my court and I benefit from your presence and all of that. And then suddenly it's like, I hate you, I want to kill you. And filling in some of the blanks of how to explain that, I'm sure there are multiple ways. But the shoe fits pretty well in this case, because there is a bit of a fraud relationship towards the Torah and Yahadut for the old guard, more secular elite of this country, in the sense that very few people would come outright and say, we have to leave our heritage and the Torah completely behind. But on the other hand, there's this sense of there are parts of it that we've grown out of and we don't need anymore, that we're wiser than. And the other parts are nice to sort of spice up your day, so to speak, but we won't let them be the executive decision maker about things to do with politics, things to do with war, things to do with the deployment of real power. And we need to have institutions that are structured to make sure that that's the case, which is why, in some sense, you could say, the role, as was much debated in the last year of the Israeli Supreme Court, that was, where it was a very contentious issue that's been put aside for the time being. That was, in the language of some, about making sure that we are kept within the boundaries that will allow Israel to remain what people often call a Jewish and democratic state. But really what they mean by democratic, when they say it's a Jewish, but not too Jewish state, meaning we don't trust Yahadut and Torah not to go in the wrong direction if they're given too much influence over the society. And so we use the word democracy to stand for that which is good that we can't trust Yahadut and Torah to lead us to. And so therefore, we have to set boundaries and sort of keep the Yahadut and the Torah in a box and not listen to certain aspects of it, because enlightenment has allowed us to move beyond them. For example, there's a mitzvah in the Torah that you have to wipe out Amalek, but we know that things are really more complicated than that, because of who knows what, the Geneva Conventions, other things the Europeans have taught us, that they learned from their gods, and that we now have to set as higher standards than the Torah we received from Hashem. That has been the deep structure underneath a lot of this in the present day. And looking at it back through Shaul and David, we're now in a position to understand what the transition from Shaul to David looks like to some degree, right? Because ultimately, David, who is an Oved Hashem to his core, who fights against the enemies of Israel with real emunah, with a desire to serve Hashem according to his will and according to his Torah, and most importantly, David, who wants to build the Mikdash, or at least wants to buy the land for it and sort of make the plans for it so his son can build the Mikdash, right? Like David is Melech HaMashiach, he's the anointed king because of his role in bringing about the creation of a house of worship in Yerushalayim. And that is, Bezrat Hashem, the unique purpose chosen by Hashem for Am Yisrael eventually. And the path of getting there is complicated, and it's hard to always see, how you get all the way there by figuring out what the next step should be. But I think that we at least can understand that there is something about the relationship between Shaul and David that we see in Tanakh that has a complex tension in it, where on the one hand, Shaul needs David, and Shaul benefits from David. And on the other hand, he mistrusts David, and he is frightened of losing his hold on political power. And that can lead to conflict, and it does in Tanakh. And here's where I think we don't want to be fatalistic, meaning the tension might be something that's always there because of the concepts involved. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it always has to go exactly the same way. The Torah is not some kind of secret way of learning the unchangeable facts of fate. It's showing you possibilities, and sometimes showing you different ways that the same kind of tension could have led, depending on choices people made. So that's important, because when it came to David and Shaul, there was effectively, what you might call a civil war within the nation that resulted from Shaul's enmity towards David. But I don't think that we should say that that's necessary. But what we should recognize is that the prophetic insight of the text is that there is a tendency to start off with Shaul and head towards a different attitude in the political order about Hashem and about the Torah, which can ultimately lead to the creation of a Mikdash, of a temple, and that transition can be bumpy and can, along the way, lead to a lot of fractiousness. But I think that the core points do perhaps suggest something interesting about the current historical moment that we're in, because we are in a moment where it clearly is the case right now that we are coping with the bitter consequences of overly trusting in the might of the state, and particularly the military might of the state, to protect us, even as we ignore how the Torah instructs us to deal with a certain kind of enemy. And that is something we can lay at the feet, among others, of people whose names both are Binyamin, right? We have Benny Gantz and Binyamin Netanyahu, and they used to work hand in hand together on our national defense. And in various capacities, and really together, and along with many others, own the last 15 to 20 years of our policy towards Gaza, towards Gaza, and the sort of the conscious choice to just allow it to fester without being dealt with, because of all of the short-term benefits of that. And just so happens Shaul was from the tribe of Benjamin, but you can take that or leave it. I think the point in any case is we've really reaped the consequences of refusing to deal with Amalek the way Amalek needs to be dealt with. And that can change. In the case of Shaul and David, if memory serves, Shaul is injured in a battle with the Plishtim, but then he asks an Amalekite who happens to be there to just kill him off so he doesn't fall into the hands of the Plishtim. And then David kills the Amalekite who killed Shaul. So you actually also have this kind of, you have Amalek there, the transition between Shaul and David. But I think that the operative point more is this, that David, we may not have to repeat all aspects of how the shift from a more Shaul-like leader who fails to deal properly with Amalek and who invites too much trust in and devotion to the kingship for its own sake. We may not have to, recapitulate all aspects of the transition in the case of, going from Shaul to David, as we see in the text. But what is true is that David is a bit of an upstart and a bit of a dark horse, that he comes out of nowhere, and he comes out of nowhere in a time when Shaul needs him because of the darkness that falls over him, and also because of the military calamity that he faces. Like, either because he needs David to play the music or because he needs David to fight Goliath. I think the point is that Shaul gets into a situation where not relating properly to HaKadosh Baruch Hu becomes a stumbling block for him. And the only way out turns out to be the rise of David. And the way David rises in his fight with Goliath is that he's someone not thought of as a weighty potentate or a mighty fighter who was already known when the battle began, but rather he was someone who, through his emunah and his trust in Hashem and his proper attitude about how to fight for Hashem according to the Torah, he refuses Shaul's armor, because the point is that he knows if HaKadosh Baruch Hu is with him, he doesn't need the technical solution, and he can accomplish more with much less. That David can be born out of that calamity, right? That he's already there, but you don't know he's there. And I think that might be one of the aspects, going back to the beginning, of the idea of Mashiach coming in riding on a chamor, right? That it's a reference to a passage in Zechariah Navi, that he's riding an ani, a poor man, on a donkey. But I think the point is that this is not salvation that comes from where you expect it to come, given that your eyes go towards where the power already is, and where you've already learned to put your trust from past successes. And that, I think, can fill us with hope, because ultimately, in their battles against the Plishtim and in their ultimate conquest of Yerushalayim and Har HaBayit and the creation of the temple, Bnei Israel are not successful in the merit of Shaul and in the merit of the leadership that they had when they entered the calamity. But rather, it was the case that the calamity was the birthplace of a different kind of leader. And, how that happens, we're obviously in a different situation than David and Goliath. It's not clear that a single individual can, with a sling and stone, make such a name for himself that that's his ticket straight to the top. But if we're talking either in other terms, in terms of other events that it's hard for us to anticipate, a scrappy colonel who maybe doesn't quite obey the orders he's given because he knows that other ones would better fit the Torah, and he does what's right, and Hashem makes wonders for him, and he wins the day. That kind of thing is already written for us out in Tanakh, so to speak. And also, we can recognize as well that all of these things are in some sense interventions of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the world, in that we don't expect them, that they appear to us to be miraculous because they involve these freak events like a single sling stone taking down the giant. And it doesn't have to be about one person. It can also be about events such as the plague that wiped out the whole army of Sennacherib, which was besieging Yerushalayim in the time of Chizkiyahu, right? That Chizkiyahu is the descendant of David. The kings of Yehuda and the sort of Malchei Mashiach, what they represent is the idea of making painful and difficult choices to do what is more correct in Hashem's eyes for the sake of his name, and being requited with miraculous deliverance of one sort or another. And there's so much zchut and so much emunah, there's so much merit and so much trust in Hashem in the hearts of our courageous fighters right now, that whether it's about some person or people in the army who are going to make a name for themselves in this war, or whether it's about what the nation as a whole learns about trusting in Shaul versus trusting in David, and how we have to deal with Amalek going forward, and how that filters through a political process, it doesn't much matter. I think the point in the end is that because HaKadosh Baruch Hu's name is on this people, and because he ultimately won't tolerate a chilul, a desecration of his name, like the kind that comes from letting the horrors of the last few weeks from the Amalekim go unanswered, that we can pray with great expectation in our tefillot that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will show us his wonders, and that this will be the beginning of a new consciousness for the nation as a whole, and possibly the discovery of better leaders who can take us down the path that consciousness makes available to us. And whether that involves conventional military victories achieved in stunning fashion by brave Ovdei Hashem who are in the battlefield, or whether it involves a storm and an earthquake that buries and drowns tens of thousands of our enemies in the tunnels they've dug underground, time will tell. But we can trust that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is with us, and that he, one way or another, will eventually carry us to the point in the path where we've put enough of our trust in him to merit his niflaot, his wonders.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.